All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everywhere. Thank you for joining this webinar. I know there are a couple of seconds until all of you guys are in. All right, welcome again to the people who just joined. You probably know me. Thank you for looking at the videos. And I'm very excited actually to participate, or actually to give this webinar today. I have to admit it's the very first time that I give a webinar, so please forgive me if I don't do it as professionally as many others do. But I've seen quite some, so I definitely learned how to do it and what works and what doesn't work. All right, so one thing that is probably important to mention, so if I look over here, I have access to all the slides, so you can ask questions regarding the other lectures. And what I also do here is I can look at your questions. One thing that just occurred to us is that the edX platform seems to have a scheduled maintenance right now. We did not really know about that, also they say it's scheduled. But that means that I can't access the questions, so I have to remember them and answer them out of the top of my head. And if I forget one or two, just open this little Q&A applet in the Hangout, and there you can post the questions and also vote for questions. So I'm going to look at these questions. So let me open this thing as well now. And as soon as you see your questions there, I can deal with them. Okay, let me try this edX again, just to see if it works for now. Okay, it seems that we are lucky, so maybe I can just sign in using my account details over here. All right. So yes, and sorry for all those just joined. The reason is I couldn't log into edX to look at all your questions because they had a scheduled maintenance, and I'm about to log in right now. Oh no, it's still scheduled maintenance. So okay, we need to do without it. So let me see if you have questions posted already here in the tab. No, there are no questions. So let me just look up what I have in mind regarding the questions that were earlier posed. I realized that there was quite some discussion. One thing that I found quite interesting is the remarks about terminology. And yes, you might have observed that I'm kind of using my own terminology, also coining certain notions like the notion of a security provider, the notion of a security consumer. And so this doesn't mean that I want to redefine the world. It's more like terminology is something very relative, and you really have to be careful when you use terminology in conversations also with other professionals, because depending on what kind of terminology they are used to, they might understand something completely different. Also terms like security were replaced with trust in certain communities, or we had this discussion, one of you mentioned that, about best practice. What does best practice actually mean? And yeah, best practice does not necessarily mean it is good. It is just what everybody else does. And so this is why I'm kind of using this term to describe security that is there for the sake of having the controls and for the sake of being able to say that something has been done, rather than being interested in the real outcome of the security measure. So this is essentially my use of best practice. And I've also been pointed to this ENISA document, which I read at the time when it came out. And yes, I think they call it good practices, because they are aware that, well, best is a bit too much. It's essentially good looking at what other people do. And the main reason there is, or the rationale there is, that if you do what everybody does, then if something goes wrong, you can at least be singled out for being particularly reluctant about your security. Okay, now I see that there are questions popping up, so give me a second to look at them. Okay, I see three questions, but none is really phrased as a question. So really feel free to, or maybe I have to select it first to see the full thing. No, it just says maybe this is a bit ahead for next week's, but let me ask you this, and then there's nothing. So when you enter your question, make sure that you have a concise question using one single field. So it's not like a chat mode. It's more like, okay, you pose a question, and I can select the questions. Everybody else will see the question, and I try to answer it here. Okay, so now it seems to be more like a question. In your opinion, so let me select this so that you may see it. In your opinion, how influential is the behavioral risk attitude of the security manager, A, in the process of risk mitigation, and B, in specifying the balance point between proactive and reactive measures, given the approximation and uncertainty? I think this is a very interesting question, and you're right, it has a little bit to do what is going to follow on the behavioral part, but let me try to give an answer right now. Because this question is at the borderline between the manager's individual incentives and the incentives of the organization for which the manager works. So think of a simple example where it might be the best option for the organization as a whole to actually accept the risk, whereas for the individual manager who thinks of job security first, maybe career opportunities, it is better to mitigate the risk. And hence the manager is more risk averse than the organization is. This is a general misalignment of the organization's incentives setup and the individual managers or individual employees' incentives. And that can be phrased in very general organizational theory. So there's nothing that is very specific to security, but of course what you might observe that in security we might have a slightly different setup than in other contexts. In other contexts we often observe that employees are more risk-seeking than the organization as a whole. So whereas in security, in particular security managers, when they fear of their job security, when they know that potential breaches are attributed to their own position or role, then they might be more risk averse. So in this sense, there is a slight tweak to the standard setup in many organizational theories. And then, yes, the question is also touched a little bit on what is the difference between rational action. So everything that I argued right now was the rational action. So we assume that we have just different incentives, and the other thing is the behavioral part. So the manager might not do the whole calculus and weigh costs against benefits, but rather react upon gut feeling or react spontaneously using heuristics and so on. And when we touch on this, I really recommend you to listen to block 5, because there you will get a more structured overview over the different processes involving attitude and attitude change, persuasion, but also like cognitive processes of decision making that influence people's decisions. This is part A of the question, so let me quickly say something on part B. What's the difference? What's the different balance point between proactive and reactive security measures? And I think it's very hard to answer this in very general, because you need to plug in specific proactive and reactive security measures. What we can say is somebody who is very uncertain, and I think Tyler and I have once tried to express this in a formal analytical model that is known as the iterated weakest link model, where indeed a lot of uncertainty leads you to reactive security measures because you learn something from observing attacker behavior. And indeed, if the security manager is not willing to take this risk, then he might be too proactive compared to the level of reactivity that is beneficial for the organization as a whole. All right, I think this was a pretty good starting question. So we consider this as done. Feel free to ask again if I didn't cover all the points. So now let me see, there are a couple of more questions. Just let me briefly browse over them so that I pick the one that fits best and the one, the raise of cost to cyber. Okay. Oh yeah, maybe a terminology question first, just as a starter. Here, the colleague asks, how will you classify McAfee? Is it a security provider or a security industry? So this is a clear example. McAfee as a whole, when it was still a individual company, is clearly the security industry because they are suppliers to security providers and to security consumers at the same time. And their core competence is in selling security. So observe that I'm not saying their core competence is security, although they are really competent on security, I believe that, but the core competence is really in selling security. You have a lot of security industry players who, well, sell security also. It's what people call snake oil. And so the security industry really benefits from this opportunity that managers on both sides, the providers and also in particular the consumers, feel a need to do something, and then they turn to the security industry. Okay, I think that was a good question to clarify. Now, McAfee, when it was an independent company, maybe I should add now, as it has been acquired by a big vendor in the IT industry, then this vendor kind of wears two hats. So when you look at the corporation as a whole, then it's certainly security providers, and they have a division that also serves the markets of the security industry. So the world is more complex than our simple models, and you will find many examples that are borderline. For example, think of a big car manufacturer. They also are mainly security consumers because they need IT and depend on the IT security provided for their organization, for their logistics, and also for their assembly processes, distribution, everything. But of course, they are also security providers in a certain sense. For example, when they develop or when they outsource development of car electronics. So the specific part, they take the role of a security provider. What I want you to take away from these different segments is that the strategy of the agent depends very much on which hat he or she is wearing. So we can't just say these are enterprises. Enterprises differ in which role they play in the market. Okay, thank you for this question. I think that helped to elaborate a little bit on our terminology. So let me go over the other questions. You also know that you can vote on the questions. So you have probably seen what other people ask. And the more you vote for the questions, the higher up they will appear on my screen, and the higher the chance that I'm going to answer them. So once again, for the late joiners, there is a temporary maintenance with edX. So I am unable to access and answer the questions that you already put into the edX platform. So if you have asked a question there, I think there was a handful, just feel free to put it back into the Q&A app in this Hangout. Okay. Okay, let me take this one. James asks, organizations often take a reductionist approach to risk, where everything is assessed on simple measures such as probability and impact. Do you think Bayesian analysis with a closer look at root causes is a better approach to decision making? That's a little bit like sticking into a, how do you say, hornet's nest. Because there is a big philosophical debate which of the two paradigms on dealing with probabilities is dominant or is true, whether it's the more frequentist interpretation or the Bayesian interpretation. I don't want to really go down this road. I think they are largely compatible. Also, some of the estimation techniques and the induced quality criteria for estimates and modeling, in particular model estimates, differ. But what is kind of behind this is, of course, you want to have a slightly more complex model that allows you to tweak with more parameters. Typically, in a Bayesian world, you do have more parameters because you leave more degrees of freedom to the specification of a model. You also infer these model parameters. And so if you are modeling the world with more parameters, then of course you can, in theory, get better predictions. But that lasts on one very important assumption, and this assumption is that you have enough observations/data to calibrate these parameters. It doesn't help you if you just bring in other assumptions, because that just makes your model more complicated to deal with, and but does not increase the predictive power. So essentially, how complex a model you choose depends on how much data you have available. And yes, if you have a lot of data, and in particular in cases when you have data points with different precision, so you say you have 100 of events and you can classify them into buckets and say, okay, these are the events where we have very precise information, and these other 50 events are the ones where we know what happened, but the information is less precise. Then you're in a perfect case for applying Bayesian reasoning, because Bayesian methods have the advantage, or explicitly model effect, that you can take account of uncertainty in your observations. And that can also help. For example, another case is, and I think that connects to a question that was posed in the forum of edX. How do you estimate your P's? So let me close this question, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to estimate the P's. And yeah, of course, that is, P is the probability of loss, so using the notation in the Gordon and Loeb framework. And yes, this is a really hard problem, and it depends really on your business whether you're able to do that or not. It is best possible in cases where you have hundreds of similar looking events, and you can then count them and essentially determine a rate, a success rate, or a breach rate. Think of payments providers who have millions of transactions, and then they know how many of them are fraudulent. Of course, in these cases, it is pretty obvious that you can estimate P based on historical data. Estimating P when it comes to rare events is a really hard problem. Then you're in the realm of extreme value statistics, and this is essentially something that you can't do already from epistemological standpoint. So epistemology is the science of discovery. So how can you find truth? All right, so that's kind of a side track. Let me go back to Bayesian versus frequent twists when it comes to estimating the P's. And if we're in a typical situation, I'm not talking about particularly rare events, but I'm also not talking about these simple, in inverted commas, cases where you have thousands of data points, as in the transactions example. In this case, you could, for example, do an expert interview and then also ask the experts for their individual level of confidence of a particular probability of loss. And when you aggregate these expert opinions, then you might also want to use Bayesian methods, because that allows you in particular to account for different levels of certainties about between different, depending on the expertise, self-assessment. So there's some literature on how to do that. It's kind of a quantitative Delphi survey. All right, so now there are plenty of new questions over here. Let me just look at them. Okay, so here we have one that already got extra votes, so maybe I should take that one. And Dilian asking, I hope I'm not out of this part theme. For what concerns the security organization and company, do you think that there should be a separation between the security policy definition figure and a more technical infrastructure management? Do you see a code? Does this, wait a sec. Okay, so the question ends there. Yeah, so that comes, yeah, that clearly falls in the scope of this part. Also, we didn't have a lot of time for discussing all the details of how to organize your security within an organization. And of course, that first of all depends quite a bit on the size of your organization. If you're rather small, then you can't devote so many resources, and one person has many hats. And as soon as you grow, you need to specialize. And of course, it makes sense to think about how to divide up the work, and also where to assign or where to put security functions within a larger organization. For example, do you want a security somebody responsible for information security at every site or at every department, or do you rather bundle this somewhere in a separate unit? All right, but this is a more specific question here. So it's more about should the policy definition be distinct from the person who manages that? So I put it in my words, if that is okay, and say, should the security strategy be distinct from operational security? Not only for pragmatic reasons, but is there a fundamental reason that suggests that? Well, you could say if you want to have some level of control implemented and like for ICE principles, checks and balances, then it could be useful if the person who implements something is not the one who controls it later on. So you have somebody who defines the goals and somebody else who implements / executes it. And then it goes back. Then it goes back to the person who sets the role, to the strategy manager, to actually control and verify if the implementation reaches the goal or not. So it's a simple separation of duties. You could also argue competence-wise, do we need different skills? So does the security policy person potentially be more on the managerial side with a business administration background, and the infrastructure manager could be an IT person with some extra education and management? You can make this argument, although I think also for defining security policy, you really need some technical background. Security is something I always tell my students where you really need to get deep into it. You can't abstract security in a way. You can't do security on the surface, and if you try to do this, you end up with policies that are good for lawyers but impractical. That's a gut feeling. You might argue this is not based on evidence, but this is what I see when I talk to many people in the area. So I really advise every security manager to also have a deep technical understanding. The analogy that I always use is also when you look at medical doctors, the first thing they study is how a healthy human body works, and then once they have understood this, they can learn about illnesses and cures. And the same thing applies to security. So when you want to do security, you need first to know how information systems work, and also on the technical side, and then you get to the level where you do diagnosis and prescribe cures in a certain way. I hope that is a helpful analogy. All right, so let me close this question again. And there's, there's one that got 6 votes. Mike is asking, let me select that one. To raise the cost of cybercrime so as to reduce the crime rate, what is the top 3 measures in your mind? It may be in the form of social, technology, political, for example. Okay, so very important, and thank you for putting these extra hats, because to me and also in our writings, the cost of cybercrime is usually the cost to society, and what you want here is the cost for the perpetrators, so that you're using an economic argument. Crime doesn't pay off. How can we make crime more expensive? Then come top 3 measures, and yeah, it's true, it's a mix of measures. It also depends on what exactly you define as cybercrime, because there is a huge variety of definitions of cybercrime, and some people, or most people, for example, also include things like cyber espionage or piracy, be it product piracy, software piracy, or audio video piracy. And of course, if you include or exclude these parts, that changes the picture quite a bit. So let me answer this question for the typical cyber crimes. So I'm going to talk about online banking fraud, phishing, all these kind of things, money mules, ransomware, malware, the infrastructure behind that. And so how can we make this more expensive? First of all, I think a measure that definitely needs to be implemented is stricter or more consequent law enforcement, because a lot of this cybercrime actually works below the radar of law enforcement. It uses international, it crosses international borders where they know that it's particularly cumbersome for law enforcement to go after the perpetrators. Reducing the cost for law enforcement, and of course increasing or investing in law enforcement skills to fight, to cooperate between nations and actually fight this kind of cybercrime has the highest priority. Then is it technology, is it social? You already see that I'm not mentioning technology to a large extent, not because I think that technology is useless. Of course, technology can do a lot, but the whole tenor of this course, and I guess this is the reason why you all are following these lectures, is that technology cannot cure it alone. Of course, you need to implement technology correctly, but essentially what is conceivable is available. It is just a matter of incentives that it's not in place or it's not properly configured at some point in time. And there are some limitations to technology. So of course, there are some things that just don't work, whatever good technology you invent. For example, making online social networks that are usable, user-friendly, and where you can recognize everybody easily and at the same time are privacy-friendly. That is just like an oxymoron that doesn't work. And this you can't solve with technology. You can only solve this with changing people's behavior in using that. So that's more on the social side. All right, I hope I have sufficiently answered that question. Let me close it and I advance to the next one. I see there's a couple of questions, and feel free also to ask back if some things remain unclear. All right, let me choose that one, which has 4 votes. Richard is asking, beyond estimating P's, how do we find trends so that we can get ahead of them? Close security gaps before there are exploits. Yeah, that is the ambition. If we could do that, there would be no need or very little need for reactive security. And so I think one of the key messages is that we probably do not achieve this state. Software is so complex that it is very, well, maybe even inefficient, but still unlikely also that we will ever have software development that does not leave security vulnerabilities in the products. So we will always, essentially run behind and close them. And sometimes we even can't do that. So for example, if the providers do not collaborate, I think these days there is a flash vulnerability out there, which is not patched and actively exploited in the wild. So you guys, including me, are all courageous that we use Flash right now for this plugin, because we might just be exploited. Okay, so that was the last part of the question. What was the first? How do we find trends? Well, how do we find trends? Observation, aggregation of data. Tyler is going to say a little bit more about that next week in how people could share data in order to jointly or join forces so that we can better aggregate what is going on and maybe be aware of trends a little bit earlier than if each of us would do it alone. And another idea that is more theoretical is to use market mechanisms. So you could think of building prediction markets and make them open that you can bet on future vulnerabilities. That would potentially incentivize people to watch and to search actively for vulnerabilities and capitalize this knowledge. Of course, it's controversial because it could also incentivize the bad guys to, well, earn something on the side while sharing the knowledge. But these markets, if they are properly designed, would elicit signals in the price level about future trends. So there is this famous hypothesis. I intentionally call it hypothesis because I'm sure it doesn't work in every aspect, but the hypothesis states that efficient markets aggregate information, and of course upcoming insecurity trends are information that is somewhere in the world, because some of the bad guys already know about it, or some people are aware of it. And if you have the right mechanisms in place to aggregate that information, make it available for everybody, it would be potentially beneficial. All right, so but just as a remark, these markets are very theoretical. There were a few attempts to establish them in the past, but none of them was vastly successful. The successful models of vulnerability markets are rather the ones that are less useful in generating genuinely new information. But still, for completeness, I would like to add this here to the question: what can we do beyond estimating peaks? All right, consider this as done. So we have about 15 minutes left, and there are two questions which are highly ranked. One has 5, another one has 4. Let me just read them. So I picked the one that fits better. Okay, I think I can relatively quickly go over this one. Amy asks questions regarding course reading, the economic incentives for sharing security information. What factors prevent encourage information sharing among organizations? Okay, so what I can easily say here is Tyler is going to talk about exactly this next week. So maybe listen to next week's, or definitely listen to this week's lectures, and maybe ask the question again or discuss it in the forum in response to Tyler's lecture. Okay, and then the number 4 votes by Richard again. What are the trends that should be guiding security investment now? Well, let me select that. I think what really matters here is how you define now. When you take this security investment, then you are typically not in a reactive perspective, talking about tomorrow or next week, but it's more like, okay, you make your investment plan that needs to be approved so that you get a certain budget, and you can spend this on security investment in 2016. Yeah, so 1 year from now. And so what should be guiding your security investment now is, it really depends on where you are, what industry you are in, what your threat scenario is. So it depends on the product or service you're offering. I don't think there is one generic answer or one general answer that applies to all kinds of industries on the planet. And even if you reduce it to like one part of the world, the US or Europe, then it's hard to identify what is the trend right now. If there's a gut feeling, maybe I can share that. If there is something that seems to be a global trend, then yeah, put some question marks. It could be just something that the marketing department of a big player in the security industry just thought out, and we know there are plenty of buzzwords in the world that made companies invest, security in depth, you name them. And not always was the measure after they have been installed as successful as people initially believed. There was also a time when everybody wanted to have a security event management system, and I don't know, well, I know a few examples where they actually work well, but they were not as useful as they were thought at the time when it was really up on the hype cycle. All right. And we have one other question here, which got 3 votes. Liam asks, let me select that one. How would you suggest we incent organizations to share incident and vulnerabilities with other organizations to better observe security trends? So again, something that is discussed next week by Tyler. And I suggest, because I just don't want to steal Tyler's thunder entirely, I suggest that you listen to his lectures, and he can say it much more precisely than I can phrase it here out of the top of my head. So now we have a couple of questions with 1 and 2. Oh yeah, there's one on vulnerability prediction markets. Let me just use this because this is one of the areas that I've been doing research on, and so I'm probably in the best position to answer it. Okay, so the question says vulnerability markets, security events, prediction markets are among the most interesting cybersecurity incentive instruments proposed so far. What are the main challenges that we need to address in order to implement such markets? Okay, so this is a good question. Let me just summarize the challenges. One of the main challenges is, of course, a legal challenge. There is one analysis back in 2007 by a US-American lawyer who essentially came to this conclusion that exploit derivatives, that's a market style that I proposed a couple of years before that. It's essentially a prediction market for security vulnerabilities. And his analysis, the result of his legal analysis, is that they will probably be illegal under US law. So this is definitely something that cannot be easily ignored. Other things are, of course, how to deal with insider trading. I was always a little bit hand-waving with that when people asked me. Then I said, okay, we know how to deal with insider trading in traditional financial markets, but actually, well, we believe we know, but we don't really. So we have this problem in traditional markets, and of course, in the case of vulnerability markets, it's a particular exposed or particular acute. Because you could have people who have access to the source code and are definitely in a better position to identify vulnerabilities. Another thing is that people could deliberately plant backdoors, and we now know from plenty of programming contests like the underhanded C contest and so on that it's pretty easy to plant backdoors that even survive through code review. And of course, that's a big challenge to vulnerability markets. Another challenge is also how to do exactly the timing, how to do exactly the process for vulnerability reporting so that you don't expose too many systems at the same time, but still get important information from the market signal. If the market starts too small, then you have the problem that big players in the industry can essentially influence the price. So it's like legitimate price manipulation, and that would indicate that their products are more secure than they actually are, so they can buy a positive indicator. So in that sense, you can't start with a small test market. You really need to go large so that also these instruments on the market can be used for hedging. If you want to read more about that, I can probably put one or two more references to the reading material, so that you can look into vulnerability markets. Okay, so you see this is one of my favorite topics. Let me also talk about the other topics. Oh yeah, heterogeneity, that has 3 votes, again from James. James says, other than increasing heterogeneity in IT systems, are there other approaches that could improve the insurance market? Well, of course, gradually you can improve by addressing all of the implements that I mentioned. You can improve the legal situation by clearing responsibilities and making it easier to attribute and substantiate claims. You can design systems that are more amenable to forensics, so again, improving attribution. And you can, of course, another option that one can consider is using kind of government intervention to bootstrap an insurance market. I'm not saying that government should actively subsidize insurance markets, because that distorts incentives, the very incentives that we want to use. But you can think of separate market segments. For example, if you have IT and healthcare and you make insurance mandatory in that segment and still ensure that there is some competition in the market, then you would bootstrap that. So once there is some cyber insurance in one subsector where ICT is used, then most likely it's going to propagate, or that the experience is going to spill over to other markets as well. Again, if you want to read more about that, I think it's chapter 9 or 9.1 of the ENISA report that Ross mentioned in the very first lecture. I think it's also among the reading material, Security Economics in the Internal Market. The full report, don't look at the abridged version, because in the abridged version we don't talk a lot about insurance. In the full report you have a couple of pages going through all these options, and I think that's still more or less up to date. Also, we wrote it back in 2007, 2008. All right, so I have one more question that got 2 votes from Albert. Select. Hi, what are you thinking about GRC systems such as semantic control compliance suites and many other, and automatic calculation of cyber security risk metrics? Well, it depends on how seriously you implement it in your organization. It depends on how your organization fits to the implicit model that this system uses. Unfortunately, not all of these systems are very transparent in what is going on underneath. And it depends on the available data and available input you feed into the system. So just by acquiring a license for such a system, you do not really improve your security. And the true cost of this system definitely comes from seriously implementing it in your organization. If you do that, then these systems definitely encode a lot of let's call it best practice or expert knowledge in security management, and you're definitely faster with such a system than trying to build one of your own or just start with Excel tables or so. So yes, it's a tool, but for putting the tool into some useful context, you need to think about kind of the indirect cost. That it means how your organization and your processes have to change so that the tool can best work in your environment. All right, I hope that answers your question. So let me just go over the remaining ones. I really have to finish in time because I have another event scheduled right after this one, and I don't want to be very late. If there are immediate questions that I still need to answer, then put them on the edX platform when the platform is back online again, and I'll take a couple of minutes tomorrow evening and respond to all open questions on the edX platform. So feel free to also follow up on something I said here. And also for those who watch this webinar, not real time. Okay, so let me take another question from Richard here, and that got 3 votes now. In my current work, I see a continuous battle. Operating exits want to move fast, IT security wants to be careful, operating exits usually wins, IT security feels they are second-class citizens. Invest in changing the mindset of operating exits and top management. So what you are saying describes reality, and that's essentially how the bigger economic framework that Ross and also I try to convey in the picture mirrors into your organizations, right? So the business comes first, and IT security only if there's one of these 3 real reasons or for the reason of compliance. But then, you are like the break. You don't, you're not a popular person in the organization. Well, change the mindset. It's probably hard. I mean, it's the choice that we made when we entered that field that we will be in this role. It's also when you decide to become a lawyer, you within an organization, you will also be the naysayer. I don't think you can easily change that. Of course, you can do a good job in raising awareness, raising understanding, make yourself establish yourself as a responsible person who also has the business in mind. For example, suggesting risk acceptance, and then exactly according to the points that I mentioned. So when something is ignored, not just ignore it because you're overruled, but say, okay, here you can accept that risk. I'm not going to complain about that, but please then document it carefully so that we have consciously chosen or consciously made that decision. And if something goes wrong, please don't blame me, because then I can point to that document and say, okay, that was a risk that was deliberately accepted. And it's just part of the business that there are some bright days and some darker days. This is how business works. Without risk, there is no business opportunity. I think this is one of the ground truths in financial markets and business in general. All right, ladies and gentlemen, with a view on the clock, I want to thank you for the participation in this webinar. As I already said, don't be too critical. It's the first time that I'm actually giving a webinar. If you have any feedback on how I did it, I will definitely also watch the video again and see what I can improve for the next instances. Feel free to just drop me an email. I'm sure you find my email address on my homepage. And if you have additional questions, just do not hesitate and just post them on the edX platform. So thank you for joining me this time, and I wish you good with the rest of the course. And I myself, I'm also looking forward to the remaining 2 weeks when Tyler and then again Ross are going to talk about externalities and the behavioral aspects and policy. Thank you very much, and have a good evening or good afternoon. Bye-bye.